Today's scripture is from Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to the prayers. Awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all, as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. This is the word of the Lord.
Last week, we did a little bit of a history of architecture lesson on homes and how they were constructed, and not going to deep dive into that again. But I did find it, and I do continue to find it remarkable that for most of human history, and certainly in the time and place in which Jesus is living and teaching, most people lived in a home that would be, probably at best a single room or maybe two. And it's really only in the last couple hundred years that kind of normal, everyday, regular people have had opportunity to own housing that actually has multiple rooms. And it's interesting to go back and look and see like where we put what and what was the priority. So last time we talked about the idea of the kitchen and how the kitchen, when homes got bigger, kind of got pushed to the back or pushed to the basement. And in the last several decades, the tendency has been to bring it up and bring it more into the center of the space because it is a center of nourishment. The other thing that happened when we started to break homes apart into multiple rooms is we still needed a place for people to gather. And for the longest time, and especially when you get to times like John Wesley's time when he lived, a house that was big enough to have multiple rooms might have a front room that was known as the parlor. And if you think about kind of what you think about when you think about like an old-timey like parlor kind of thing, it probably has like wood furniture in it that looks really uncomfortable, right? Maybe there's some like whiskey decanters off to the side. Not that we would do that kind of thing. We're good Methodists. But it was kind of this like semi-formal, not super formal idea where you could have some place. It was a place to gather and maybe converse, or whatever. I think one of the only places you will continue to find rooms that we call parlors today are in churches. We have one. It's right over here. Just as you come in the main doors, if you turn right, you'll have a parlor, and it kind of looks like you would expect a parlor to look, and that's kind of what we use it for, are these kind of informal to semi-formal little gatherings of people when you'd have a meeting, that kind of thing. So still something you might find in a church, but recognizing there was a time when this is what was in people's homes. And, and usually the parlor is where the men gathered, because the women were sometimes usually gathered somewhere else, maybe in the kitchen and back. However, that has changed. Most of us, we're looking at homes today, looking at our own homes, or on the renovation shows like Fixer Upper, those kinds of things. You don't see a lot of people saying, what I really need is a semi-formal parlor space in the front of my thing, to entertain, the local gentry. Maybe you do that. Great. I don't think most of us do. And so those rooms have kind of changed focus now. And today, instead of talking about things like parlors, we're more prone to talk about things like living rooms, right? And one of the times that transition started to happen in earnest was with this invention right here, which of course is the invention of television. Now, a weird thing happened in the 1950s. At the beginning of the 1950s, almost nobody had a television. Like less than 1% of homes in the United States had a television in 1950. By the end of that decade, almost 85% of homes had a television. In a single decade, that's how fast. Until the internet brought things like personal computers in our lives, never have we adopted a technology faster as a country than we adopted TV. Right? And if you were from kind of like anywhere around like my generation, you recognize that TVs used to be these big giant things that sometimes came with their own furniture, right? So we had a console-style television because we were fancy, which is basically a giant heavy TV inside of a giant heavy wooden box that meant the whole thing weighed about 1,000 pounds. So once it was in place, and it was huge, right? I mean, the TVs used to be these huge, giant things. And so they started to take up prominence in people's living rooms, because that was kind of the place that was big enough to put it. And as we started to do that, the family began to gather around it. And this was pre-streaming days. You know, you couldn't just watch what you wanted when you wanted to. You had to watch what they showed you when they showed it to you. And if you all wanted to see the same thing, you actually had to physically gather together at the same time and do it together. And so living rooms became a lot less formal in this age and became a home for family. And over time, they began to get bigger. The average size of a living room today is something like 40% bigger than it was in 1960, because those rooms have taken on more and more uses. And if you think about the places that maybe you gathered with your family growing up to watch TV or a movie or a sporting event, or play cards or do any of those kinds of things, it was probably in a space you called the living room or the family room or something like that. We need a spot in our homes where we can do life together. There are certain things that we simply cannot do on our own, and whether that's helping your young student with homework or whether that's not gambling. That was Freudian. All right. Not gambling, gathering together for family movie night or, again, watching sports or whatever it is. We need a space for that, because that's one of the things that we as humans like to do. Not only do we like to do that, we need to do. We need times and we need places where we can do life together. As it happens, this ability to identify that as something that is good and wonderful and special, that when we are doing life together, whether it is hard things or simple things, when we are doing that, that is one of the things that the early church recognized very early was important. And in fact, right from the very beginning of Christianity, so we're right here in Acts, we're not only in Acts, we're in the very beginning of Acts, so these are the first followers of Jesus. These are the people who no doubt actually sat at Jesus' feet and heard his teachings, that are being gathered together by the disciples, that group of people that sat in countless people's living rooms with Jesus or around the campfire. They spent so much time doing life together with Jesus that they spread that to anybody and everybody else that they met. That early church not only coalesced but thrived in people's homes, in communal spaces. And in fact, in some of the earliest letters we have from the Apostle Paul, if you go all the way to the beginning of those letters or all the way to the end, when he tells you who they are being written to, oftentimes they are written to somebody's name and to the church in their home. Because at that time and in that place, we did not have buildings like this to gather in, so we gathered where we could. And oftentimes these early church gatherings were really odd and strange, because you would see people gathering together and breaking bread together that you would otherwise never see together anywhere else. You would see rich people and poor people. You would see Gentiles and Jews. You would see Romans and non-Romans across all stratas of society. You saw Christians gathering together in people's homes to follow in the teachings of the apostles, to learn, to have conversation with each other about what this is, the whole thing is, and what it is that they were doing. Yes, as part of that process, they shared their resources with each other, because if you are in space with somebody, if you are sharing life with somebody, you no doubt learn about the things that they are struggling with, and if you are at any way disposed, you will often think, well, how can I help? That is one of those things that happens in those spaces. So people were able to identify needs, identify resources, put those things together in this informal but in truly empowering and amazing way. And yes, we would eat together. We've always eaten together. That has been a Christian thing from the beginning. Jesus loved to feed people. He loved to feed his disciples. He loved to feed the people with the loaves and the fishes. And when we gather after our worship time together out there for cookies and cheese, and I love the cheese, we don't do it just because it's nice And we don't do it just because we need a snack and we're a little hungry after all this hard worshiping we've been doing. We do it because that time out there and the conversations that happen out there, that doing life together out there is almost as sacred and important as what happens in here. This is what we do, and this is what we have done from the beginning. The early church faced countless trials and tribulations. People grew suspicious of what they were and what they were doing. The authorities of the day, whether they be the religious authorities or the political authorities of Rome or whoever it is, didn't really like it when people gathered together without them. They weren't sure what they were up to. So these early Christians, there was all kinds of rumors about who they were and what they were, oftentimes unflattering ones. And you can ask yourself, how do you get through those hard times? How do you continue to be who you are? How do you continue to be faithful? And the secret that the early church understood is that you don't do it alone. That our faith, the faith that we practice, is something we are meant to do together. So that when I feel weak, I can rely on you. And when you feel weak, you can rely on me. Now, this idea would kind of ebb and flow in Christian history. And if you kind of look at Christian history, you will see we started off for the first several hundred years. That's basically all we did. Eventually, we started to build places like this, and they even got grander than this place. And if you've been in Europe and seen the grand cathedrals that we've built over times, you know that we kind of went the other way for a while. We started to build these grand, wonderful places for us to gather together and worship. But even while we were doing that, even while we were gathering in these grand cathedrals, there were still meetings happening in people's homes and smaller places, because there's something about doing life together that is so important. Wesley would bake this into the very heart of who we were as United Methodists and what it is to follow in a Wesleyan tradition. Wesley would not organize people into class or into church groups or anything like that. He would organize people into class meetings that met in people's homes, with, as you might expect, the simple purpose of doing life together. When Methodists came here to the U.S. And began to take off, it began to take off in the West, and that was the place where we found our most success. And what was interesting is when pastors would gather, or people would gather together in these Methodist meetings, they would meet wherever they could, whether that was in the local saloon or at the library or whatever public space might be available, or saving that, whoever had the biggest home and the biggest parlor is where we would gather. And much like 2,000 years before with the early church, the other interesting thing happened when Methodists began to gather together is social barriers got broken down. And suddenly people who, were employers and employees, people who, men and women, any of the barriers you can think of we might put up, came down as people gathered together in these early groups to find a way to support and love one another in a place that was hard and difficult all across the American West. And most churches today, most Methodist churches especially today, when they were originally founded, it wasn't actually the church building that they often built first. They built the parsonage first. Not because the pastor was going to be there all that often. This was in the circuit riding itinerant pastor days where you'd be lucky to see me once a month. But you'd have a place for me to stay when I came, and otherwise, the kitchen and the parlor/living room of that home would be used to do the work of the church. And it's only after they grew enough that they started to build places like this. It's amazing if we think about our own living rooms and our own lives, no doubt how important that has been to us. Pretty much all of my best Christmas morning story or memories happen around the Christmas tree that we put in our living room. Big things and small things have come out of these places. About 100 years ago, there was a guy named Bill, and Bill was traveling to Ohio. And Bill had actually been part of this group called the Oxford Group. Great sounding name. And the Oxford Group was this religious movement of the time that really saw this wanting to return back to this kind of early Christian idea of small groups meeting together, and especially small groups meeting together in people's homes. And it was actually started by a Lutheran pastor here in the United States. He didn't get a lot of traction with it, so he went back to England and found, because of Wesley and his ideas and the fact that they had been inundated with class and band meetings and all that kind of stuff, that actually the whole of the Church of England was interested in the same thing, and they began to take on this idea of small group meeting. And so while he was there, he started this group called the Oxford Group that eventually came back to the United States. And it wasn't tied to any particular denomination or any particular tradition, but it was this notion, this idea that the Christian faith is best practiced when we do it together and we're in a place where we're able to support and love with each other in a real way. And one of the persons that got involved in this idea, this ministry, was a guy named Bill. And Bill had to do a lot of things, and one day on a business trip, he got to go to the great state of Ohio. Now, I lived in Ohio in 4 years, so I get to make fun of Ohio. But I'm not going to this time. But Bill happened to be visiting there, and he was part of this group. And while he was there, he had heard that there was somebody else in town who also had a little bit of a connection to the Oxford Group, who was himself struggling in a similar way. And it was actually the town surgeon, and his name was Bob. And if you don't want to think, well, we got to get Bob and Bill together, I mean, obviously, right? The short named B Club is a small group. But somebody had recommended that Bob reach out to Bill in his troubles, and they got together one evening, in Bob's living room of his home. And both shared with each other the struggles that they had. And the struggles that they shared together was a shared addiction to alcohol. Bill had made some progress through the Oxford Group, through meeting in small groups, and talking and supporting one another through the process of getting sober. And he was a little further down the path than Bill was, or Bob was. So when they talked together, Bill was able to encourage him. And one of the tenets of the Oxford Group and one of the tenets of their movement was this idea that you really become part of it when you bring somebody else in, right? Bob and Bill sat and had a conversation. And Bill decided to invite Bob into a different way of thinking about life and a different way of thinking about his addiction. And together they decided to craft a path forward for people who faced a similar challenge, because both of them had encountered so many people who were struggling in the same way. And many of you now already know this history, but Bob and Bill would focus, and that pathway that they would develop would become known as the 12 steps. And they would be known as the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. One of the most successful public service, public health groups that is all lay-led that has ever existed. And it was born out of Bill and Bob being willing to be open to one another and to begin to commit to do life together, and it started in a living room. If I think about the most profound moments of my life, if I think about the place where I introduced most people to my children right after they were born, the place where my parents got to hold their grandchildren for the same time, in both cases, it was in our living room. When I think back about the moment that I could finally say out loud to somebody for the first time, I think my life lives somewhere else than sitting in this office. I think my vocation might need to shift. I think God might have some other different purpose for me to be a software engineer for the rest of my life. The first time I could admit that to anyone or say those words out loud was to a small group of people who were gathered in my living room. Important things happen when we do life together. When everything is going great and wonderful, we can somewhat delude ourselves into thinking it's really maybe not that important. But when life gets hard, when the world gets tough, we recognize that oftentimes the ways that we get through the hardest of the moments is we do it together. I remember. There's not a lot I do actually remember about the first couple of weeks after my wife died. I remember the morning, that first morning, sitting in my living room with my 2 children on either side of us, in this brief little span of time when the first group of people who came to support us had to go and before the next group arrived. I remember sitting in that room, holding my children tight, not having any clue how we were going to get through the next hour or the next day or the next week. And then others joined us and sat with us in our living room. And we got through the first hour, and we got through the first day, and we got through the first week. It was an important and sacred time in that space. As Christians, we do faith together. We do life together. It's what makes us us. And when we do that for each other, we do what Christians have done from the beginning. And when we do that, God no doubt shows up. The Spirit no doubt shows up. And suddenly, we can find hope where it feels like none can exist. We can find the comfort we need when times get really hard. And we can live the life that Jesus modeled for us to live.